Our two sessions today are related to dangerous business and workplace hazards. And I have the pleasure of introducing the first speaker. This is Dr. Matt Kiefer. He's a professor of internal medicine, and also he's a professor of environmental and occupational health sciences at the School of Public Health. He additionally has an adjunct professorship in global health. This describes some of his background. He earned his medical degree from the University of Illinois, followed by his master's in public health here at the University of Washington. And he actually, early in his career, spent a few years in Nicaragua, working with the government and looking at pesticide exposure. His research interests are broad, but he has characterized them as being interested in issues related to environmental justice in the United States, and occupational and environmental health issues in Asia and also Latin America. He is a leader in quite a few different research groups, and one of them is called the Pacific Northwest Agricultural Safety and Health Center. And they do all kinds of research. Some of them relate to skin disease from the farm workers. They get exposed to pesticides. And as shown here, he's also tried to prevent ladder injuries among orchard workers. He is an internist and an occupational medicine specialist. He will actually describe the history and explain what an occupational medicine doctor is and what they do. Much of his practice is here at Harborview Medical Center, but he also, once a month, volunteers, and actually he established and he conducts an occupational medicine clinic that's in the Yakima Valley for the farm workers. This is in Toppenish, Washington. And this clinic is run under the auspices of a center of excellence here. It's called the Chemically Related Illness Center. He has been very active mentoring individuals locally and internationally, and he's received many awards. One of them was recently the MLK Award for his outreach contributions. And he may have his mind in the clouds, but he's a very creative thinker. And this shows him in one of his hobbies, his leisure activities. He's the pilot here with his program assistant. And his leisure activities take him many places. This shows Matt on the Olympic Peninsula with a lobster mushroom in his hands. He is going to share with you some of his travels and his experiences. And I know that you will definitely enjoy the stories he has to tell. Join me in welcoming Matt.
Thank you. I suspect that many of you probably don't even know there was a profession called occupational and environmental medicine. I didn't know there was one until I applied for a residency program in it and discovered the richness of the experience. How many people here have ever had a job? How many people have ever had a blue-collar job? And how many people have ever been injured on the job? So a substantial percentage of you have had injuries on the job. Occupational medicine focuses strongly on occupational injuries and occupational illness, but also focuses on environmental illness and injury as well. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a number of the different aspects of occupational medicine, including a history of how we came to be and our important figures, how occupational medicine physicians are trained, what kind of training we undergo, what are the common problems we deal with, and how does the specialty actually do what it does, what's unique about what we do. And I'm going to give you some examples of occupational disease, and then at the end we'll have a short pop quiz, and the questions will be handed out as you leave, and you'll need to hand those in before you go. I think any medicine Medical specialty worth its salt dates itself back to Hippocrates, and occupational medicine is no exception. Hippocrates was the first physician who started to talk about issues in the environment and in work that may affect people's health. Following that, we have a very long hiatus of time before anyone begins to talk about occupational medicine. And then the initial book on the subject was written by Bernardino Ramazzini, published in 1700. And he's considered the father of occupational medicine. He made several very important points about ergonomic issues, though he had a number of different diseases described. A lot of the science has obviously been surpassed since that time. But he did start bringing people to the awareness that occupation and work could actually cause disease. Most importantly, he pointed out the fact that that disease happens as a result of the kind of work that people who do blue-collar kinds of things we think about now are exposed to, the kind of things that they're exposed to. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that at the end, which his attitude toward that situation. The first occupational cancer was identified by Percival Pott, and it was scrotal cancer in chimney sweeps. It was a relatively uncommon cancer, but was commonly seen among children or young boys who did the work of chimney sweeps. The other thing that he identified was a lot of ergonomic issues because of all the dancing they did around the chimneys. And that was there was a good treatise on that called Mary Poppins, and I think if you've seen that, you probably understand that. Alice Hamilton, the mother of occupational medicine, is actually Alice Hamilton. Alice Hamilton worked in Chicago, actually lived in Hull House with Jane Addams, and was part of that movement around Hull House. And she began to describe the diseases of workers in Illinois and established the very first occupational health section in a state government in Illinois. And she was the chief of that. She studied a number of different exposures, including lead, radium, and you may be aware of the radium effect of the painting radium dials, because they actually used radioactive material, and mostly women were hired for this job, and they would paint the radium dials, and in the process, lick their paintbrushes so that they could get a good fine point on their paintbrushes, and a lot of them suffered from osteosarcomas of the jaw and other cancers related to the radium that they were exposed to. And Alice Hamilton was one of the people who described that. She also described a number of other diseases, and she was the very first female medical faculty at Harvard. However, she was not allowed to use the faculty club. She couldn't get tickets to the football games. I don't know why she would want tickets to the football games, but she couldn't get them. And she never got beyond assistant professor, even though she stayed there her whole career. She was never promoted beyond assistant professor, and that was a function of the sexism of the times. But she was obviously very important to our profession, and we revere her very, very highly. So occupational medicine is really occupational and environmental medicine, because we pay attention both to the exposures in occupation and the work that people do and the environment that they do, the environment in which they're exposed. It's within preventive medicine. So you've probably had some exposure to the fact that there are boards that enfranchise their various specialties, and preventive medicine is the board that oversees occupational medicine. And in preventive medicine are a number of subspecialties, including aerospace medicine, hyperbaric medicine, and medical toxicology and occupational medicine. It's a very small residency. About 90 people are trained every year to do in the residency programs. There's only 32 residency programs, and they have just a few residents each. So it's a relatively small specialty. Most of the occupational docs work for big companies. They may become medical directors in companies. They may work for academia like I do, or they may go into government. They may work at OSHA or NIOSH, the organizations that either study occupational disease in the United States or regulate occupational exposures in the United States. Or they may go into large clinic systems because of the amount of occupational disease that's periodically seen. Occupational medicine physicians are trained with an MPH. At the present time, it's a requirement that you receive an MPH in order to be board certified in occupational medicine, so you do a master's in public health. We study toxicology, biostatistics, epidemiology, industrial hygiene, and health services. So we have a pretty broad background in a variety of aspects in both the health field and also the specifics of the things that we see in our clinical care. We do have clinical training, but it's primarily an outpatient clinical experience, and most of our patients are not hospitalized. Most of them are seen in an outpatient. Most severe hospital events or events that result in hospitalizations are taken care of by surgeons or internists who would be in the hospitals. Requirements generally are 1 year of internship and then 2 years of residency training. So how big is occupational disease? Worldwide, what are we dealing with? Well, about 2.2 million people die yearly from occupational accidents and illness. So it's a substantial number of people worldwide who die. But there's 270 million occupational accidents that happen annually worldwide, estimated by the World Health Organization. And about 160 million new occupational diseases, which is the broad spectrum of diseases that we deal with. These are thought to be probably a relatively substantial underestimate of reality, because the reporting systems in most countries don't report on occupational diseases very reliably, and so the numbers are based on relatively unreliable numbers. And to give you some basis of comparison, about somewhere in the neighborhood of 0.7 to 2.7 million people die of malaria every year. Malaria, one of the most important, if not the most important disease in the world, is comparable in terms of the number of deaths to the occupational deaths that happen because of workplace exposures and workplace injuries. So it's a very substantial number of people who suffer from occupational diseases and illnesses. In the United States, we do have relatively good statistics, and the numbers that we see are the timber cutters. People who cut down trees are the most dangerous profession in our country of those that we keep track of. Fishermen actually are, and then timber cutters are next. Fishermen, primarily, these are primarily crabbers. And you see here you can see here the deadliest catch. Did people see that was on TV for a while? It talked about the work of crabbing, and it's principally the crabbers that suffer the greatest number of deaths. And they have about 400 deaths per 100,000 per year, which is really enormous. It's a very substantial number of people dying in that profession. Pilots and navigators are next on the list, and then we go down. You can see even farm occupations is on there, but roofers and construction workers are in there as well, and a very substantial number of people die in those professions. In the United States, we have about 55,000 deaths that are related either to accidents or illness every year due to those causes, and about 300,000 occupational diseases are diagnosed annually. About 3.8 million disabling injuries happen every year as a result of occupational exposures. And this costs us, obviously, a very substantial sum, $120 to $155 billion a year. What's different about occupational medicine? Well, a number of things. We study a different group of diseases to some degree. One of the most common long-term diseases that we deal with, chronic, persistent problems, is hearing loss. I'm not going to talk about that a lot. It's a relatively well-understood disease, but it's a very common disease. I had a patient in my clinic a little while ago who I had fitted with a hearing aid, and I asked him when he came back in for a visit, I said, Mr. Jones, how's your hearing aid working? And he said, Doc, it's working great. I can hear everything. I can hear a pin drop. And I said, that must be great, because your family must really appreciate that, because I know they were having trouble communicating with you. And he said, well, I haven't told them. But I've changed my will 3 times in the last 2 weeks. So most physicians diagnose disease. That's the focus of their profession. In occupational medicine, most of the time the diagnosis is not so much a problem. We oftentimes get a patient referred to us, the diagnosis is clear. Patient has asthma, patient has lung cancer, patient has one other disease or another. What we oftentimes have to deal with is attribution. What caused this disease? We have to go through the history of the patient's exposure and try and figure out what in their history might explain why they have this disease. Most physicians don't deal with those questions. Why do we do that? Primarily because of a system called workers' compensation. Workers' compensation is a no-fault legal insurance system that exists in every state in the union. It's required by law that every state has to have it. It varies from state to state. Some states, worker compensation is relatively easy to get. In other places, it's harder. There's a couple things about the worker compensation system. It covers medical care, it covers time loss and rehabilitation from an injury, and it'll cover usually disability and death benefits to the family if a person dies. Worker compensation rates can be very different for different professions. As a medical professional, my worker compensation rate, what my employer pays to the worker compensation system for my time is about 25 cents an hour of my work. So for every hour I work, about 25 cents goes into the worker compensation system. So if I get injured on the job, or if I get sick on the job, like maybe I get an infection, maybe hepatitis or something like that because I get stuck by a needle or some other kind of problem, that's paying for the insurance that will cover me in case I get sick. So it's not very much money. A person who works in a shingle shed cutting cedar shingles pays $14 an hour for their worker compensation. $14 an hour because of the amount of injury that those people are subject to and the cost of the injuries that they suffer. Loggers pay about $9 to $10 an hour per hour. For every hour they work, that much goes into the worker compensation system to cover their expenses. And so that helps pay that system that covers the injuries that may happen. I use the O.J. Simpson trials to illustrate the difference between the way physicians in general make diagnoses and think about diagnoses and the way an occupational medicine physician is asked to think about causation or attribution. What happened in O.J. Simpson's criminal case? Was he convicted or acquitted? He was acquitted. What happened in his civil case? He was found culpable. He was found responsible in his civil case. Now, why is that different? Why was he found not guilty in the criminal case, but found responsible in the civil case? Reasonable doubt in the criminal case. What about the civil case? More probable than not. It was more probable that he did it than that he didn't do it. So that's the difference between the way medicine thinks about disease generally and occupational medicine thinks about attribution. So when a doctor thinks about disease, if I wanted to establish a new set, let's say I got a new test, I just developed a new test, and I'm measuring plasma porcelain. If I want to know what the normal range of plasma porcelain is, what would I do? I'd get about 100 normal people who I assume don't have porcelainopenia and test them to see what their range is, and I'd establish a normal curve, just like the one we see here, right? And I would say people who are within 2 standard deviations, or about 95% of the curve, are normal. And anybody on the tails of those curves are abnormal. They're too far away from the mean to be normal. They've got to be abnormal, either real high or real low. Generally speaking, that's what we do in medicine. If we have a test, we run a test. Now those ranges can be very different. For instance, the pH of blood, the acidic content of blood has a very narrow range that's compatible with life, whereas other things have a much broader range. Sodium can range a lot more widely. Serum sodium can range a lot more widely than something like pH. And you can live with a relatively low sodium or relatively high sodium, whereas that's not true of pH. So, but if you look at the curve, we're still dealing with 2 standard deviations around the curve, and the tails of the curve represent those abnormalities. So this is equivalent to the reasonable doubt proposition in law. A reasonable doubt is that very, very tiny little bit on the end of the curves that either represent too high or too low, and that's why I compare the medical diagnosis to reasonable doubt. You really have to be pretty abnormal to get a diagnosis in most cases. Whereas if we go into occupational medicine, it's based on tort law, the law that tells us if it's more likely that somebody did it to you than didn't do it to you, then they're responsible. And preponderance of evidence, 50% probability, a coin flip plus. So in worker compensation, when I'm asked by a worker to say, is my disease due to the work I was exposed to, I try to get to the point where I can say probably yes or probably not. And I only have to get to that 50% point to make that distinction. Now, occupational medicine, you might gather, is a very legal profession. We do a lot of legal work. And I have enormous respect for lawyers. But I do remember this one story about a physician who was on trial. He wasn't on trial. He was actually being deposed. He was in the witness box, and the lawyer was asking him about an autopsy that he had been involved in. And he said, "Now, Dr. Robinson, isn't it true that when you filled out the death certificate, you did not examine the patient?" And the doctor said, "Yes, it's true, I did not." He said, "Isn't it true, doctor, that in fact you didn't listen to his heart, you didn't listen to his lungs, you didn't even look to see if he was breathing, did you, doctor?" And the doctor said, "No, I have to admit I didn't. But let me put it this way. His brain was in a jar of formalin on my desk. But for all I know, he might be out practicing law somewhere." So, in terms of your responsibility as a physician, when you're practicing in medicine, in this state of Washington, you are obliged to file a claim if you believe it's an occupational disease, unless the patient says he or she does not want to file. And that's true for anyone who's covered under the worker compensation system. There's a couple of other diseases in occupational diseases that we're obliged to report in the surveillance system, and those are occupational asthma and occupational pesticide poisonings. Both of those have to be reported. So by way of knowing what your legal responsibilities are as any kind of a physician, not just an occupational physician, these are your legal responsibilities. So I'm going to talk about a couple of diseases you're probably familiar with, and I'll explain a little bit about them. So, the Mad Hatter. Why was the Mad Hatter mad? Sorry? Mercury. Why did he have mercury exposure? Pardon me? The felting process. So what they used to do in the felting process is they'd take fur, beaver fur mostly, and they'd expose it to a mercury vapor, which would cause it to peel up a little bit, peel the scales up on the fur, and when they matted it down, it would join. It was used in a couple of other phases in the felting process, but they used mercury vapor, which is the most effective way to get mercury into the body. And mercury is a very toxic chemical, particularly to the central nervous system. And the Mad Hatter displayed many of the characteristics of mercury toxicity. In fact, in the United States, we have a disease named after the hatters in the United States called the Danbury Shakes. Danbury, Connecticut, a place where was the center of the hatting industry for many years, had characteristic tremor associated with people who were exposed to that from the mercury toxicity. It was referred to as the Danbury Shakes. And Alice Hamilton was one of the people who studied that actually in Connecticut. So, mercury toxicity, it was common in the old hat-making industry, and it was pretty devastating. What am I talking about here? Lead. Lead in old paint. So, lead toxicity from old paint. I had a patient in clinic 2 weeks ago who had been sanding a building to prepare it for painting. He came in with a lead level much higher than he should have, well into the range where he had to be removed from work. It's still a relatively common problem. Lead in paint is not that common in Washington State. It was used very heavily back on the East Coast, not quite as often on the West Coast, but certainly a problem. And who's particularly susceptible and likely to develop lead toxicity from peeling paint? Children. And why? Because they put things in their mouths all the time. And interestingly, lead is said to be sweet. In fact, it's been used as a sweetener in some wines. It's been added to wines, and certain calamities have resulted from that particular practice of adding lead to wine. But it is a sweetener, and it's been used in that regard. So lead toxicity, it causes both peripheral nervous system damage to the peripheral nerves in the body, and damage to the central nervous system. It's also associated with anemia, and in kids, that's oftentimes the first thing you'll see is anemia. The kids will show up with anemia. But they can also get abdominal discomfort and constipation. One of the things that we see in, Joanne talked a little bit about the international work I do, and one of the things I see a lot is lead recycling, battery recycling, the recovery of the lead plates in lead acid batteries. And this oftentimes will happen as a cottage industry in people's homes. They'll be breaking these things open. They'll use the casings themselves to heat to burn and heat up the lead to reform the lead plates, and then sell the lead plates. So that's a relatively common problem, particularly in developing countries. You recognize this individual's face. This is the same guy before and after his exposure to dioxin. Dioxin is a chemical. You see its clinical, or its chemical structure there. And it's been associated with diseases over time. Yushchenko was one of the very best examples of what it can do to you in an acute, high-dose situation. It was apparently put in his food, and I think it was while he was running for the presidency in Ukraine, and he developed toxicity from this. It was finally diagnosed in Vienna, what he was suffering from, but you can see the distortion that it did to his face because of what's called chloracne. Chloracne is the disease you see here. The individual's ear, it's a comedown disease where open comedones are developed, particularly around the face and eyes. It was also one of the toxins that was associated with Agent Orange. Agent Orange, which was a pesticide, one of many pesticides that was used in Vietnam to knock down foliage so as to deny cover to the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, was sprayed, and it was a combination of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, two herbicides that were commonly used at the time. The only reason it was called orange is just the barrels were just marked orange, so it was called Agent Orange. But it was the one that was most heavily used. 2,4-D is something that you may use in your garden. It's a common pesticide still used today. 2,4,5-T you'll never find on the market. And the reason is because 2,4,5-T in its manufacture, the process of its manufacture, created dioxin as a byproduct, and that's how it ended up in Agent Orange, contaminating Agent Orange, and as a result ended up in Vietnam and was responsible for presumably a lot of illness there, although there's still a lot of debate about what exactly it's causing and what it's associated with. And it's still a topic of study by the Institute of Medicine in the National Academies of Science. Now we have dioxin contamination in Seattle. I don't know if you saw the news. This is the date it came out. Dioxins were found in the dirt in South Park in Seattle. And this is an article that was done by Robert McClure in the PI. Another thing that's a very important chemical exposure that is now becoming more and more obvious and more important is arsenic. Arsenic principally in water. Bangladesh, for instance, the water systems in Bangladesh, a lot of the tube wells that were drilled in Bangladesh to deal with the contamination, the bacteriological and parasitic contamination that people suffered from drinking surface waters. They drilled a lot of tube wells. UNICEF and a number of other international organizations drilled wells into the ground, but they tapped into an aquifer that was contaminated with arsenic, and as a result, somewhere in the neighborhood of 77 million people are suffering from chronic arsenic poisoning in that area of the world now. And the more we look, the more we find. The more places we look for arsenic, the more we find them. Washington State has a number of pockets of arsenic contamination in water. And that could be, arsenic can happen because of natural contamination or because of mining shifts in water tables and oxidation of arsenic and release into the water table, increase in solubility. So it can happen from a number of different sources. In eastern Washington, one of the pesticides that was heavily used for many years before DDT was introduced was lead arsenate. It was very heavily used up until about 1948 or so, when DDT and the organophosphates were brought in and basically replaced it. But lead arsenate was used very heavily, and many old orchard lands which have now been converted into housing are contaminated with lead arsenate. But these are the signs you see in lead arsenate, or in arsenic overexposure. You get a hyperkeratosis, sort of a thickening of little punctate calluses on the hands and on the feet. Skin cancer results from some of these. You can see this individual is missing a finger. You get a vascular disease, which is a contraction of the arteries, which causes ischemic loss of tissue and sometimes loss of appendages. And you can also develop lung cancer and various other cancers, including bladder cancer. So one of the things that really excited me about occupational medicine after I had done internal medicine is that I always liked rare diseases. And common diseases are commonly seen, but it's not rare to see a rare disease, but you rarely see a single rare disease because they're rarely seen. But there are a lot of rare diseases out there. And so I was always fascinated by rare disease. I was also fascinated by toxicology, and so I went into occupational medicine and have had a lot of fun doing it since. I had a patient in the clinic the other day that had had a problem. I called him up on the phone, and I said, "Mr. Jones, I've got some good news and I've got some bad news. Which one do you want to hear?" He said, "Well, what's the bad news?" And I said, "You got us stumped. We don't really know what this is." He said, "Great. What's the good news?" I said, "We're going to name a disease after you." Well, part of the reason that we see new diseases in occupational medicine is because we deal with so many different chemicals. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 100,000 chemicals in relatively common use in the workplace. And we know relatively little about these chemicals. Many of them came in, they were never tested for toxicity, and as a result, the first people who have exposure to these chemicals in any large numbers in which we can potentially observe disease are workers, people who are handling these chemicals. About 2,000, somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 new chemicals are introduced annually. And those used in large amounts are usually tested by the National Toxicology Program because of the potential that they have of causing disease, because a lot of people will be exposed to them. But the chemicals that are used in smaller amounts in segments of processes in industry are not tested for toxicity in many cases unless they unless they're analogous to another chemical that is likely to be toxic. And then they may undergo testing. But many chemicals might be introduced into the workplace without our knowledge of their potential toxicity. Vinyl chloride is an example of one of those chemicals. Long ago was introduced into industry. Vinyl chloride, monovinyl chloride, is the thing we polymerize to make the plastic that you're sitting on, the plastic that covers your desk, the plastic that carries water through your pipes. Monovinyl chloride is the monomer, and we polymerize it to polyvinyl chloride, or PVC, the thing you know well. It was noted early on that monovinyl chloride, workers exposed to this and even animals exposed to it to develop liver disease. It also causes changes in blood vessels. And if you can appreciate, I don't have a laser pointer, but I think I can get at it with this. You can see, here's a normal hand with normal ossification through the bones. In this, you can see there's loss of ossification in the tip. That's acrosteolysis. That's where the tip of the fingers start to deossify. And that happens in the vascular disease associated with vinyl chloride. Their fingers would literally start to shorten up. The other thing that they would develop is a particular cancer called angiosarcoma. And the way this was identified was a couple of occupational physicians at B.F. Goodrich saw a couple of cases of angiosarcoma. Now remember, rare diseases are rarely seen, and it's not rare to see a rare disease. But if you see two rare diseases, you should be on the lookout, and you should try and figure out why you're seeing two cases of the same very rare disease. These guys were sharp enough to realize they had seen two cases of angiosarcoma, and they should see less than one in their lifetime as a physician because it's such a rare disease. It's about 1 in 10 million develop angiosarcoma, and they were seeing it much more frequently than that, so they started asking the question, what's going on? They did a study, and they found that angiosarcoma was resulting from this exposure to monovinyl chloride. And as a result of that, industry was forced to tighten up their exposures, and now exposure to monovinyl chloride is very closely regulated. And we don't see angiosarcoma presumably as much as we would have had that continued. Now, yesterday I came upon an article in the International Journal of Occupational and Environmental Health describing 2 cases of angiosarcoma in hairdressers. Vinyl chloride, up until about 1975, was used as a propellant in hairspray. And they only late, long after the rest of the industry was required to crank down on the amount of exposure people had, were they required to remove it from hairspray. Because it was covered by the Consumer Product Safety Commission rather than OSHA. OSHA could force producers to take it out of their processes or to crank down on the exposures, but the Consumer Product Safety Commission had less control, and so it stayed in the product till about till 75 or so. And these 2 cases have been potentially associated. Now, that's a tremendous latency period. That's a very long latency period for a cancer as aggressive as angiosarcoma. But it's possible that it's associated. They're hypothesizing that it is. But the coincidence of these people using a vinyl chloride-containing product back then and having this extremely rare cancer is impressive. Another disease that we recently started to see is called nylon flocking disease. You see this jewelry case here? You've probably all seen these jewelry cases, and they have this sort of fuzz on them. They're sort of fuzzy. That's nylon flocking. And what it is it's nylon fibers that have been cut very short and then sprayed onto a plastic or vinyl coating that's then put over the box or used in a variety of different situations. And that flocking, nylon itself is a relatively inert product. It basically doesn't induce much. But when cut into those fine fibers, relatively insoluble in the body, it hangs around in the lung and seems to increase inflammation, cause an inflammatory process, which results in fibrosis, in the laydown of fibrotic tissue in the lung. And people went on, in factories where they were investigated, went on to develop fibrotic lung disease. So this is a relatively new disease that we started to see about 10 years ago. It was first described. Probably it existed before because nylon flocking had been around, but sometimes it just takes a while for us to sort of catch up with it and discover it. This is the newest of our occupational diseases, popcorn worker's lung. Popcorn worker's lung was described first in Missouri in a popcorn factory that made microwave popcorn. And there were a number of people in this factory that had gone on to develop restrictive lung disease, and actually several went on to transplant. Several died and several went on to transplant. The restrictive lung disease is called bronchiolitis obliterans. It's a fibrosis resulting from inflammation of the air tissue, of the airways. And here's a CT scan of it, and it causes this inflammation in the tissue. What the response was from diacetyl. Diacetyl is, has anybody in this room, has anyone here ever tasted Chardonnay wine? You know that buttery finish, that buttery flavor? Part of that flavor is diacetyl, a natural diacetyl that's in the wine itself. It's a natural flavor as well as a concentrated flavor, and it gives that buttery flavor in many foods. And so it's used in a lot of different products. Well, why didn't we know this thing was dangerous? Well, it turns out that because it's a food and you can eat it and it won't hurt you at all, and you can drink Chardonnay wine within limits and it won't hurt you, everyone assumed it was perfectly fine to breathe. And it turns out that when you heat it up, it causes an irritant effect on the lung and causes this bronchiolitis obliterans and this inflammation. Epidemiologic data that was done, collected in these workplaces, found that people had 11 times the risk of fibrotic lung disease who had exposures in the mixing rooms. And there's been one consumer of popcorn who's developed what might be bronchiolitis obliterans related to this. It was an interesting story. There was a woman, one of our colleagues, one of our pulmonary occupational medicine physician colleagues at National Jewish Hospital in Colorado, was seeing a guy who had been diagnosed with bronchiolitis obliterans, and this had just come out, this information, and she was, trying to figure out all the possible causes of bronchiolitis obliterans, of which there are not many. But she had gone through his history, and then at the very end, in a total exasperation, she said, by any chance, do you eat a lot of popcorn? His response was, I am popcorn. And then he described to her what he did. He would heat up 2 to 3 bags of popcorn every day, rip open the bag, put his face in it, and breathe it because he loved the smell and flavor of popcorn. So this guy effectively had created what was amounting to an occupational level of exposure to this bronchiolitis obliterans, or to this diacetyl, creating that condition. It was relatively mild, as I understand, and I haven't heard the results of the case yet. The last fiber I want to talk about is asbestos. Asbestos you're all familiar with. You know it's all over the place. It's still in areas like pipe insulation. It's still in brake linings, and it's still in clutch faces. We have not gotten it out of products in the United States. We should get it out of products because it's one of the best understood carcinogens out there, and yet we still see it coming up. It causes a number of diseases, including a restrictive fibrotic lung disease, but also causes a very unusual cancer called mesothelioma, which is a unique cancer, a hallmark cancer of that particular exposure of asbestos. But it also raises the risk for general cancer, for lung cancer in general, by about 5 times over normal. Combine it with cigarettes, and it goes up to 50 times over normal. You mix cigarettes and asbestos, and you're up to 50 times normal risk for asbestos-related lung cancer. Here's a picture of a mesothelioma as it encases the lung, sort of wraps around the lung. It develops from the pleural lining around the lung, and here's a picture of it on X-ray. And this is my attic. And this is Libby, Montana. And Libby, Montana, if you followed the news, was a place where vermiculite, the stuff you put in potting soil, the stuff you put in your attic as insulation, was found to be contaminated with tremolite asbestos, shipped all over the world. And very substantial numbers of people, both working at the mine in Libby and living in Libby itself, developed asbestosis related to this. I thought, okay, everybody knows the risk of vermiculite. Nobody's sending this stuff. Nobody's using this stuff anymore. Well, 3 weeks ago, I had some reagents delivered to my lab, and this is one of my research assistants, Randy Treadwell, and he said, isn't this, he opened it up, and he had actually TA'd my class, so he knew about the risks of vermiculite. He said, isn't this vermiculite? And, you know, having this stuff in my attic, I know what vermiculite looks like. I said, yeah, that's vermiculite. So we took it into the lab, and we looked to see if it was contaminated with asbestos, and certainly it was. So this is what vermiculite looks like, and it was sent to us in a nice little package housing these reagents, and we had a sample of it. Now, it was most heavily concentrated right on the caps. When Randy and Lee Monteith, our laboratory guy, took a look at this part of the cap, that's where he found the tremolite asbestos, right there. But it was also embedded in the vermiculite itself, this stuff here. So keep an eye out for that kind of stuff, because you will see it. It's in a lot of buildings. It's fine if it's not disturbed, but if you create dust in the process of mixing it up, you'll release it. Now, musculoskeletal disorders are among the most common problems that occupational medicine physicians see. Back pain is a huge problem because we're bipeds, and we were probably supposed to be quadrupeds, and instead we're walking upright, and our backs don't handle that very well, so back pain is extremely common. And the other thing we see in occupational medicine very frequently is overuse syndromes like epicondylitis and carpal tunnel syndrome. But the one thing I want to show you before I close is this. Ramazzini, who wrote this book in 1700, was writing to his book when he wrote this. And it sort of illustrates this attitude that I think occupational medicine physicians carry with them to some degree, which is that we work with the workers. Our patients are the workers. Our commitment is to the workers, and that's who we work with very closely. And he said, you're fated to wrap up something greasy. He was talking to his book. He said, you're fated to wrap up something greasy. You must know you were born in the grimy workshops, not in elegant mansions of our betters, not in glittering court where chief physicians lay down laws for cooks but sit down nowhere. Trust me, then, you will suffer this more lightly than do books that boast prouder titles. If they read you and straightway send you packing back to the workshops, remember, you were born there. Thank you. And I'll go ahead and take questions till about 5:02, and then we'll take a break. Please, if you have a question, come on up to the microphone. Why don't you just line up if we have enough questions to line up?
I was wondering, in your experience, can you draw a causal connection between all these new chemicals that are being developed and that we're being exposed to and the general increase in cancer prevalence over time?
I think you can draw correlations between specific chemicals and cancers. We have lots of chemicals that we know do cause cancers. Some cause a lot of cancer. Some cause cancers very strongly, and some less strongly. Mixtures are one of the greatest challenges that we face in terms of trying to figure out, do mixtures of various chemicals cause specific diseases? Because the combinations are enormous. So it's difficult to say, in general, did this happen? Possibly, but we're also living longer, so we have more time to develop cancer, and there's a lot of other factors that are going on. We're also better at diagnosing cancer. So there's a whole bunch of different things that are happening contemporaneously as we are introducing these chemicals. But we definitely know that there are chemicals that cause cancer, and asbestos is a good example.
Okay. As I understand it, our regulatory system in the U.S., when it comes to chemicals, is kind of more lax than, say, the Europeans. Would you say that we should adopt a more cautionary or cautious approach to introducing new chemicals and reevaluating older chemicals?
Right. Our system tends to be, if it shows a problem, then you remove it. So we wait for something to happen, and then we act on it. Whereas the European system, called the REACH system, it actually has a name. The responsibility of the producer, the person who's going to profit from the chemical, is responsible to show relatively no likelihood of harm. And so they have to do tests before they put a chemical into the workplace. They have to show that the chemical is unlikely to do harm. Our system, on the other hand, that responsibility is not in place. I tend to favor the REACH system. I think it's reasonable. Yes?
Do they know why MS is more prevalent in the Pacific Northwest than any other part of the country?
You'll have to wait for the neurologist to come up and talk about that. I don't.
Oh, you don't? Okay, thank you.
Another question?
Do you foresee like nanotechnology being developed to help these different types of cancer and such to attack those certain cells? And if so, how do you think that they would approach that, given that the cells might become immune to all the different the chemicals and treatments?
I think nanotechnology is going to bring with it a number of benefits, including their ability to deliver drugs and act in different ways, because when particles become nanoparticles, they behave differently than larger particles. But the other problem with nanoparticles is we don't know what their safety is. It's very likely that we're going to see safety issues around nanoparticles and nanoproducts that we've never understood before, have never seen before. So I'm looking forward to plenty of opportunities to continue to see new interesting diseases, because I think we're always introducing new kinds of things into the workplace, and nanoparticles is one of those things. Another question?
Do you get involved at all with the Nalgene bottle, plastic bottle?
I haven't personally been involved.
Okay.
I've followed it a little bit.
Is it BPA?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, over
Yes.
here. You mentioned earlier that sometimes when people don't file claims, that's when you don't get involved. Have you ever seen any cases where workers will not file claims out of just fear of their employers, or that kind of case?
That is a very frequent phenomenon. The worker compensation system is set up to be a no-fault system that a worker can access and not have to sue their employer. And there are presumably protections in our system to prevent employers from discriminating against workers who have filed claims. Unfortunately, I've seen that system not work well, and I've also seen employees who are fearful of filing claims. And the less secure they feel in their job, including for whatever reason, their level of skill, their security in terms of their immigration status, anything else, tends to magnify that fear because there's a lot more power in the hands of the employer. So yes.
How would you suggest that we address that problem? Should physicians be required to report such claims in the future, even if the worker does not ask for a claim to be filed, just hypothetically speaking?
Well, you could potentially report anonymously, but the worker compensation system is not a surveillance system. It's an insurance system. So it's not made to be a surveillance system. Although we use it for surveillance, it's not a surveillance system. What you're describing is more of a surveillance system, which is in the interest of the worker compensation system because they're an insurance company that would want to control injuries and illness if they knew about them. And that's an option. But I have to say the worker compensation system generally doesn't think like a surveillance system. It thinks like an insurance company. And the people who run it think like an insurance company.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So imagine for a moment that you're a lowly research assistant in one of the labs here at the University of Washington.
Please, let me steady myself.
And after a series of experiments, you've been left with the odious task of disposing of, say, 6 gallons of this fluid, which is maybe 1 part, a 4% paraformaldehyde solution in blood and 3 parts saline. What do you do? And as a kind of lemma to that, what is the formaldehyde and paraformaldehyde in like embalming processes and cemeteries and stuff? Does that get into the water supply? Do we look at that at all?
The answer to your question is something that you probably look up on the website and talk to health and safety at the university, and they'll give you very direct advice as to what to do with it, and particularly what not to do with it.
I wish that were true.
And the second part of your question was what?
Just as far as formaldehyde in something like the water supply, leaching from a cemetery used in embalming processes and stuff like that. Is there
risk associated with it?
Do we monitor that at all?
No, we don't. We don't monitor it. We might monitor the content of water, but formaldehyde I don't think is one of the things we routinely look for in water.
As a workplace hazard, is it very dangerous? Is it
Well,
you're inhaling it all the time?
Formaldehyde has been associated both with allergic disease and cancer. It's been connected to cancer as a weak carcinogen. So, yes, there is some risk to it.
Thanks.
Another question? One more question, we'll take a break.
I'm curious to what degree you use animal models in your studies of human behavior, and in your work, do you end up...
Personally or occupational
Personally or in general,
health in general?
or how useful are murine and
Well,
rodent models?
Toxicology uses animal models all the time. In fact, the LD50, the lethal dose 50, the most succinct number that describes the toxicity of a chemical is based on animal models most of the time. I mean, there are human estimates of LD50 as well that have been developed from epidemiologic studies, but animals are used all the time for studies of carcinogenicity and toxicity and endocrine disruption and all kinds of things. Okay, why don't we go ahead and take a break? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.